PIA Media, your media, your way.
All right, good morning, everyone. We are in session 8 of our course, Sheroes, African Women of Resistance. And this is our second to last meeting. So we'll meet next week to close off this series, and then we'll take a break and we'll come back in the new year with What History Left Out Part 2, African history from...
I'm going to my class. I'll talk to you.
African history from... we're going to change that title because I realized it used to be African history from 7/11 to 1896. But I think I might change the years with that. But I'll talk about that more next week. This week, we are going to be talking about various collective groups of African women that fought against resistance in the first half of the 20th century. So we're going to go up to the 1950s today. So the end of the 19th century, the end of the 1800s, up to the 1950s. And we're going to be looking at multiple places across the African world. So we usually have picked one geographical area or maybe two and focused on those. We're going to jump around a lot today and talk about these women as collectives. Now we will highlight a few individual women, but the focus today or how these collective groups of African women resisted in various ways, not just violent ways, and resisted against various forces of oppression, from colonialism to Jim Crow segregation and various other forms of anti-Black racism and internal oppression as well. So last week we talked about spirituality a lot, and we talked about the use of spirituality in Kenya and in Rwanda and in Zimbabwe, that these sisters used to fight against colonialism as it was being established or after it had been established in their various locales. Today, that conversation is going to continue because spirituality never really leaves these discussions. And so we'll make these links as we go on. So where we're going to start, we're actually going to start in the USA. So we finished last class in East Africa when we were talking about Mika Talili Barmenza in Kenya. Now we're moving further to the West. We're going to start in the US, then we're going to work our way around. So right around the time of the end of the 19th century, right before colonialism was really about to kick into gear, enslavement ends in the United States. And this is through the efforts, and we talked about Harriet Tubman and what she did to bring about the end of enslavement, her contribution through the Combahee River Raid and so on and so forth. And it was after African troops were allowed to enter the fight that the Civil War was won for the Union Army. Once the Civil War was won, the South was divided up into military districts that were overseen by the Union Army. And these troops had a lot of social problems that they had to contend with. Number one, what do you do with these millions of Africans that are now liberated? They're free, but certain promises weren't kept to the Africans. You know, generals like Sherman and others had promised 40 acres and a mule at the end of the Civil War. So Africans could have land, Africans could have access to resources and build economically. Without that, you're just setting folks free without resources. So what do you do with these millions of Africans? So various public, what is that? Yeah, make sure that everybody's muted. Daniel, if you could make sure everybody's muted. All right, so the Reconstruction period was this period when the Northern troops controlled the South as military districts. They had to figure out how to best serve these millions of Africans that were now liberated. Organizations were set up such as the Freedmen's Bureau, which was kind of a social services organization that, gave folks basic education, access to the Freedmen's Bank, which was something that economically sustained people during this period. And it was also an era where the victorious Union made sure that the Confederates, the whites that had rebelled against the United States, the slave owners, couldn't have political power anymore, at least for a period of time. So you have to imagine the psychology of this. These Africans are free. So these Southern whites have lost millions of dollars in property because black folks were property, and now they're free. The people that they had said were inferior, that were next to animals, are now completely free. Not only are they free, the 15th Amendment gives the men of those Africans the right to vote. Women couldn't vote until the 1920s, but black men could vote with the 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is the Equal Protection Amendment. So, all people are equal under the law, supposedly. That's the 14th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment ended enslavement officially unless you are locked up. If you're locked up in the United States, you can still, to this day in 2022, you can still be made a slave. But other than that, slavery was abolished. So with this political power, blacks in the South rose. You had blacks that served in Congress, you had a black senator, you had blacks that served in the state legislatures. They redrafted Southern constitutions. They did a lot. They started the South's first public schools. So this Reconstruction era was one of the few eras in U.S. history where democracy was truly being practiced. Democracy was truly being practiced. But like all good things, they come to an end. And they came to an end around 1876. Now, throughout this period, those white Southerners who had rebelled were gaining political power slowly, because even though they had rebelled against the Union, against the government, their white brothers in the South, in the North, were like, you know what, they've been punished enough. Let's bring them back into the fold of the country. So they had to take these allegiance tests, and they had to pledge allegiance to the United States again. And slowly they started getting political power. Eventually, the presidential election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes and his opponent Tilden was very close. And a compromise was made between the two political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. Now, this might surprise you, but at this time, the party that was for black people, strongly for black people, and that black people were united with, was the Republican Party. The Republicans were the radical equalitarians. They were the ones that pushed the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment, and they were for black folks. And black folks, seeing Lincoln as the great emancipator, and he was Republican, black people would vote Republican all the way up until the 1930s. And then there'd be a slight switch, and then by the 60s, the switch is really there, and black people have been Democrats since. But at the time, black people were Republicans. It was the Democrats that were the party of the racists, that were the party of the plantation owners, that was the party of the Ku Klux Klan, which also arose during this period. It was an organization of these Confederates that were upset that they had lost the war and they couldn't take it. And they couldn't take that blacks were roaming around free and had political power, and they didn't. And they formed this terrorist organization. Well, that terrorist organization could only do so much during these years because the Union troops were stationed in the South. They were there to protect black rights because, unfortunately, the political rights were given to black folks, but not necessarily the economic rights. It's the same thing we'll see with apartheid South Africa. You can get the vote, but you're not getting any land, and you're not getting any reparations. So the troops are there, and black people aren't as armed as black people are armed, but they're not as armed as they need to be because the troops are there. When this very close presidential election comes about, it's decided that, okay, you'll get the Southern votes for Hayes to become the Republican president, but we want a concession. We want these Union troops out of the South. And that compromise led to the end of Reconstruction because the whites in the North and the South agreed that's what they're going to do. So they took the troops out of the South. Once the troops were taken out the South, those white terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and the White Camilla Army, so on and so forth, they grow in number. They grow in ferocity. They start lynching black people that even have a modicum of economic success. They start lynching black people that are exercising their rights for political participation and their right to vote. They start lynching white folks that are allied with black people in some of these places, like New Orleans, where they lynched the whole mob of Italian Americans who had employed black people and were working for the political rights of black people. So this terrorism has led to the Democrats regaining control in the South, and the supremacy law, white supremacist laws start coming back into play. The Jim Crow laws, segregation everywhere, black folks being forced back into slave-like conditions of sharecropping. We see the rise of the prison industrial complex in the South, where, okay, the 13th Amendment clearly says we can't enslave you unless we lock you up. So guess what? We're going to start locking you up. And we're going to rebuild the South, in a large part due to enslaved black labor, even though slavery is supposed to be over. So all of this is happening. So after 1876, 1877, we see a downturn in the life chances and life choices of black people throughout the United States. They're suffering in the South. The North isn't much better. You know, there's tremendous segregation in the North, tremendous segregation in the Midwest. In fact, that's as we get into the 20th century, that becomes the epicenter of the Ku Klux Klan. It's not even really the South. It's places like Indiana become the Klan state, where the governor was a Klansman and the state legislature was controlled by Klansmen. So this is pervasive. So during this time period, resistance took the form of survival. Survival in this hell that was the post-Reconstruction period became a form of resistance. And the people that lived that were African women. In tandem with, you know, African men as well, but we want to highlight the role African women played, and they played this role collectively. Starting in 1896, and we talked a little bit about this, we talked about Harriet Tubman because she was there. In 1896, the National Association of Colored Women was founded. This was a collective of black women, largely middle-class black women that got together and said, because of these Jim Crow laws, because of the racial terrorism, the lynchings that are killing black men, women, and children, because of lack of educational opportunities afforded to black people, we're going to come together and we're going to do something for our people. We're going to be responsible for the uplift and survival and the development of our people. So they formed organizations like the National Council of Negro Women, people like Ida B. Wells Barnett at the top, Mary McLeod Bethune at the bottom, people like Mary Church Terrell. These women were fearless. Ida B. Wells Barnett in particular, because she took it upon herself as an investigative journalist to study lynchings. So you have this woman going around the South, going around the Midwest, collecting information about lynchings. And what she found a couple of patterns. That number one, lynchings were mostly economically motivated. Black man comes, black family comes, they set up a store, a grocery store, and it's doing quite well in the town. White folks don't like it. That man, possibly even his family, end up being lynched. But the reason for lynchings given by the white folks was never, oh, we were economically jealous, so we killed this black man. It was always, or more often than not, the result of the accusations of sexual violence against white women. That was, this black man sexually assaulted a white woman, we're lynching him. This black man raped a white woman, we're lynching him. This black man attempted to rape a white woman, that was always the reason given. That was the constant. So Ida B. Wells Barnett went, studied these, realized it was economic because one of her friends was actually lynched, and she knew it was for economic reasons. She writes a book called The Red Record. She dispels all these myths. She says, number one, black men are not sexually assaulting white women. That's not true. And then when we really look at who's actually sexually assaulting who, it's black women that are the victims of sexual assault and rape by white men. And these black men can barely get justice for that, because if they go and kill or attack the white man that raped their wife, their daughter, then they're going to be killed. And then that family will be even more vulnerable. So that's what was going on at the time. Ida B. Wells, she went around the country fighting for this. She even pulled a Rosa Parks. Before Rosa Parks, she was on a streetcar, and they told her she had to give up her seat. And she actually fist fought the conductor of the streetcar before. So unlike Rosa Parks, that was very dignified, and she's I'm gonna get out of the seat, she gets arrested. Ida B. Wells was like, I'm not giving up this seat without a fight. They got into a tussle. So this was a very courageous woman. Ida B. Wells Barnett. Mary McLeod Bethune was an educator. She started Bethune-Cookman, which is now Bethune-Cookman University in Florida. It was fighting for education because these women realized that we need education as a people. If the South is not going to provide adequate education because they're not going to fund black schools. If the North is not going to fund the schools that black children go to, then we're going to be responsible for the education of our children. They fought for access to healthcare in black communities, childcare service, housing for orphans, job training, and just the broader struggle for social and human rights. These were very courageous women. And these organizations had chapters all over the United States, bringing women together, working with men. A lot of these women were in multiple organizations. So you'll see their names pop up in the early formation of the NAACP, later on in the Garvey movement, which we'll talk about. So they were active throughout the first part of the 20th century. Very courageous women. One of these women was a woman by the name of Anna Julia Cooper, and their work wasn't just national, it was also international. She was one of the attendants, along with three other women, at the first Pan-African Conference in 1900. This was a meeting organized by the Trinidadian Henry Sylvester Williams, who had studied in Nova Scotia, who then went to London, and he, alongside a Haitian diplomat named Benito Sylvan, who had also served in Ethiopia. This is all during so this Haitian, Benito Sylvan, went to Ethiopia after the Battle of Ottawa in 1896. So he went from liberated Haiti to liberated Ethiopia, and he worked with the emperor. But he was in London at the time, and he convinced Henry Sylvester Williams to organize this conference that was going to bring black people all over the world together. And this is, again, 1900. This is right in the middle of post-Reconstruction America, right in the middle of colonization in Africa, right in the middle of all the oppression that was going on against black people in the Caribbean and in South America, and in the black people that were in Europe. So they all came together. And Anna Julia Cooper was one of them. She was a member of these black women's groups. She writes a book called The Voice from the South. And she's one of the first people to really articulate this idea that we now call intersectionality, that black women suffer from multiple forms of oppression, gender oppression, racial oppression, as well as oppression because they are workers. So she brings that up all the way back in the early 20th century. So she's one of these women. And they had a concern for what was going on with the entire African world. It wasn't just about the United States. Across the border, the same energy is pervasive even in Canada. When you got groups like the Colored Women's Club of Montreal, which started in 1902. So Montreal at this time, the black population in Montreal is growing because Montreal is one of the hubs for the railroad in Canada. So a lot of black men are coming up to serve as porters on the railroad. It's a very lucrative job for black men, even though it's a very oppressive job. And it's not until they organize the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters that their rights are respected as workers. But before that time, horrendous work conditions for these brothers. But it was a job that a lot of educated black men wanted to get into because it paid very well. So you would have black men with college degrees that became porters. And they brought their wives up to Montreal with them. And their wives served as domestics and different things. And Canada was just as bad as the US. So don't get this idea that Canada was ever some place that was, kind to black folks more so than the US. Because in Montreal, there was only certain jobs you could do if you were black. If you were black, you were a domestic or you're working on the railroad. There's nothing else for you to do here. And we're not extending any social services to you. So the black women's clubs, they filled in that gap. They said, if the government's not going to take care of us, we're going to take care of us. We're going to start a social benefit society where we're going to help each other out when times are tough. Insurance, so when people die, that it can be buried properly, because a lot of the cemeteries wouldn't allow even black people in death to be around white people. So they bought plots of land so black people could be buried properly. They took care of the sick when there were flu epidemics in Montreal, and white hospitals wouldn't treat black patients. They took care of it as nurses. Understanding the power of the church, it was these women, along with a handful of men, that started the oldest black church in Montreal that still exists, the Union United Church. And they were coming from different denominational backgrounds, Methodist, Baptist, everything. They said, look, wherever we were in the States, we got to come together. We know how important spirituality is to our struggle, how spirituality is to our community. So they formed this United Church. So many activities that these groups did, sponsored education. And then once more brothers and sisters from the Caribbean started to come to Montreal as well after World War I, they incorporated them. They welcomed them with open arms. Oftentimes we get this idea that, you know, these groups were competing against each other. This wasn't the case in Montreal. When the brothers started working as porters, the brothers from the Caribbean, everybody said, we're black, we're all struggling. Come on, we're going to form a community. And eventually this organization became even more West Indian than it was initially. Africans coming from America and also Africans coming from Nova Scotia that formed the nucleus of this group, the Colored Women's Club of Montreal. So you see this club movement emerge throughout North America. Very important role that these sisters played. Going south now to Haiti. The U.S. invades Haiti in 1915 using some pretext. You know, basically they're saying the same thing that they're saying in 2022. If you're following what's going on in Haiti, the same type of argument that, oh, Haiti can't govern itself, so we need the U.S. to step in, and we're going to land Marines in Haiti, and we're going to take over the country because obviously these niggas don't know what they're doing. That's the mentality that they had. It's colonialism. It's the same thing that was happening in Africa. The United States attempted to colonize Haiti and controlled Haiti for 20 years. Rewrote the Haitian Constitution. The first thing they changed, Haiti's Constitution all the way since 1804 said no foreigners can own land in Haiti, really meaning no white people can own land in Haiti. That's the first thing they changed in the Constitution. Brought in American companies, essentially turned Haiti back into slave conditions, forcing people to work in on agricultural projects, mining projects, different things that they had going on in Haiti, all run by these American companies with American economic interests behind these political decisions. The Haitians resisted, and they formed the Cacao movement. These were the fighters that resisted U.S. imperialism in Haiti. And many of these fighters were Haitian women. Now, there's not a particular name that I can point to you with these fighters, but I can tell you that all the records talk about how hard the women fought alongside the men, because they didn't write down a lot. The records that we have of the movements come from the U.S. military records. So they'll just say, we captured so-and-so rebels, and there were 5 men and 6 women, or this, that, and the third. This is what happened. They fought hard. They fought a guerrilla war against, they knew they couldn't match up with the U.S. Marines one-on-one, but they used the terrain to their advantage, hit and run tactics, and they pressured the Marines. And they pressured the Haitians that worked with the Marines, because there were some sellout folks that when the U.S. came in, they basically joined up with them. So these were the rebels. These were the emancipators of Haiti who fought against the U.S. from the time that they landed to the time that they left in 1935. In addition, they also had diplomatic support from these sisters in the Black Women's Club movement. People like, sorry, her name is escaping me, but this is occurring during the Harlem Renaissance. Who wrote their Zora Neale Hurston, who had visited Haiti, and others, Black women that were in the NAACP, International Association of Colored Women, wrote letters to the U.S. government saying, this is wrong. This invasion of Haiti is wrong. We support our brothers and sisters fighting against you in Haiti. So they had the support of African Americans at the time that the struggle was going on. Once it was over and the government needed to be rebuilt and things needed to be established to lead to Haiti's further development, you had Black women such as the League of Feminine Action, the social, this is in French, but it's the, what is it, would this be in English? The Feminine Action Social League, which was established right before the U.S. left. Just like the Black women's clubs in the U.S., education. They fought to change Haitian laws that had relegated women to second-class status. You had women like Madeleine Sylvain Bouchereau, who became the first female lawyer in Haiti. And they fought not only against the presence of the U.S., and structural inequality in Haiti, but they also fought against gender inequality in Haiti. There had been some vestiges of that because many of the Haitian leaders had, although they were free from the French, they had adopted French attitudes toward gender. And they had created a situation where Haitian women, particularly in the urban areas, were basically treated as second-class citizens. So these sisters fought against that. So oftentimes, and we should always remember this, it's not just about fighting external enemies. It's also about fighting internalized ideas of oppression within Black communities that try to relegate women to second-class status or not afford women the same life chances and life choices as Black men. So they fought against that. Very about going over the other side of the Atlantic. So this is all around the same time where we're seeing these sisters collectively rise up against oppression. So now we're going to Igbo land, Southeast Nigeria in 1929. This is sometimes called the Aba Women's Riot or the Ogo Umu Nwanyi, the Igbo Women's War of 1929. Now we talked in our last seminar, we did a seminar on Nigerian history about the importance of women in Igbo society and the importance of women as controllers of the market in Igbo society. Well, the colonizers knew that as well. And when the British colonized Nigeria, one of the main things that they wanted to get out of Nigeria was forced labor and taxes. Forced labor and taxes. And now initially, when they come into Igbo land, the British realize that they have a little bit of an issue that they don't have in Southwest Nigeria and in the North. In the North and in the Southwest, you have established monarchies for the most part. It's very hierarchical in the North. Very hierarchical in the North, where you got the Caliphate of Sokoto, Kano, so on and so forth. In the Southwest, you got the Yoruba kingdoms, you got the Kingdom of Benin, you got these kingdoms. So there's a Oba or an Elephant, there's somebody in charge that you could talk to. In Igbo land, it's a little different. The Igbos had created a political situation where power was spread a little bit more evenly throughout the society. So in some Igbo villages and communities, you had a men's council and a women's council, and they talked, and a consensus had to be made before big community decisions. And you had different formations like that throughout Igbo land. So the British realized that, okay, we need to create some people that we can negotiate with. And they created an institution called warrant chiefs. Warrant chiefs. And these were brothers that were handpicked by the British who had probably got a little bit of British education, missionary school education, and these were going to be the appointed people that the British said, you're now in charge of this group of people. So whenever we have to collect taxes, whenever we need to discipline people, you are our boys in the area. And we're going to give you these red caps to show that you're important, that you're a warrant chief, these bright red caps. Well, you know, the Igbo kind of let that go. They let these people operate, and they were collecting taxes from the work of men. Men would have to pay taxes. But the British government wasn't satisfied. And in 1929, the governor told the warrant chiefs that, yeah, we're going to start taxing the economic activity of women as well, because the crown needs more money, so they're engaging in a lot of activity. We're going to tax them. Big mistake. Big mistake. Once word got out that they were going to start taxing women who controlled the market, if you went into a market in Igbo land, it was women that ran it. Men farmed, men did different things, but women ran the market. And there's even a spiritual element to this as well. We talked about how Igbo towns were historically set up. The market was not only an economic space, but also a spiritual space. So when the women hear about this, the first thing they do is they go up to these warrant chiefs that are telling them this, and they start knocking their hats off. They're like, listen, that doesn't mean, that little symbol that the Europeans gave you that makes you feel like you have power, it means nothing. So they start removing their caps. They started looting factories, burning down the native court buildings, or these buildings created by the Europeans to, penalize indigenous people and to use European laws. So they attacked the symbols of colonization. These court buildings weren't there before colonization. This is something that the British brought in. blocking the train tracks so that the British couldn't operate economically, cutting telegraph wires. They knew the symbols and the tools of the colonizer. This is what they needed to extract the resources from Nigeria. This is what they needed to communicate, to control this vast area and these millions and tens of millions of people that lived in this place called Nigeria. They released prisoners from colonial jails. They say, hey, you were probably locked up for breaking a law that's illegitimate to our culture. So we're letting you out. It's not like you're a murderer or anything like that. You didn't want to pay your taxes to the British, or you did this, we're letting you out of jail. They confiscated colonial property. They went wild against this tax to the point that the British were like, okay, we made a mistake. We will not tax the women. Obviously, we can't do this. And then, things went back to as they were. But this goes to show the power of women acting collectively, what they could accomplish, because they got that tax taken away. So very important uprising to be studied. Very important uprising to be studied. And it shows the political participation of African women needs to be valued more. Because even in 2022, it's like our leaders of our countries forgot about this. They forgot about these women that we've been talking about in the past couple of weeks, because still most of the parliaments, legislatures in Africa, it's not 50-50 parity. And in the one country that it is over 50% in Rwanda, that's because of a genocide. And then even still, it's not really those women don't really have as much political power as they should, because there's a dictatorship, a nominal, ad hoc, de facto dictatorship in Rwanda with Paul Kagame. That's a whole nother story. But these sisters show what you could do when you work together, when you're fighting against injustice. So this is coming from us from Igbo land in Nigeria. We're going to take a break, and we're going to go back to the States to talk about something that had impact all over the African world. And we're going to introduce this sister, who many of you may not know, but who was incredibly influential, Queen Mother Audley Moore. We'll talk about who she was after our break. So any questions, Daniel? Anything in the chat or any hands that are up?
Mr. Thomas, go ahead. If you're speaking, you're on mute.
Good morning, all.
Morning.
I'm wondering the difference between spirituality and obia. For instance, in Jamaica, obia was outlawed, but spirituality still is practiced within different organizations, different churches, so on and so forth. So could you give me an idea as to the difference between both?
There is no difference. There's no difference. It's just that because obia was used to fight against enslavement, that's why it was outlawed. And, some people in more recent times have used obia to try to hurt people, and it's gotten a bad reputation. But you can use Christianity to hurt people. You can use Islam to hurt people. You can use any spiritual system to hurt and exploit people. People do it every day. So obia is not unique in that. But what made obia unique and vilified in those places, it comes from the adoption of the colonizer's mentality. The colonizer said, obia is harmful to my project of slavery and colonialism. Therefore, we need to outlaw it. And subsequent people, our people, have adopted that mentality as well. So there is no difference. Obia is just African spirituality that was used to fight against enslavement. But some people have used elements of it to hurt other people, but you can do that with any spirituality anyway. So if you're an outlaw obia, then you got to outlaw the church, because there was just some guy in Jamaica a couple of years ago that was using the church to commit all types of heinous acts. So you can't pick and choose which spiritual system you feel has done more harm. So there's no difference. Yes, sir. I think that's Mr. Francis. Go ahead.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
You mentioned the fact that black men in Canada could only find a job as sleeping car porters. And that's true because at one time, Canada was regarded as having the most educated porters in the world. And that also reminded me that there was a Chief Justice, a black guy. He was from Grenada. His His name was Julius Isaac. And he was the first black Chief Justice in Canada. And he too, I found out after he passed, worked as a porter in Toronto, even though he had a law degree.
Yeah, yeah, that is.
He was able to work his way up all the way to be Chief Justice of Canada.
That is how many of our ancestors got their first jobs here, and older relatives. So I remember Robert said, you told me, you said you found out your father he told you he was a porter. Yeah, it's real. They did a really good show. When did that show come out in the spring? Called The Porters on CBC. It was really a well done show. It's worth checking out. It talks about this time period, and it talks about the role of the sisters in this time period as well. Anything in the chat, Danny, before we go to Robert?
No, there's nothing in the chat right now.
Okay, Robert, go ahead.
I was just going to comment that I don't know if people know. Wait a second.
Yeah,
the Giller Prize, the Giller Prize, which is the biggest literary prize in Canada, it's $100,000, was won by this book, The Sleeping Car Porter by Suzette Mera's sister. And it's about a story about a sleeping car porter, and it's good.
They're a very, very influential group, and if we ever do a class on Black workers, the story of their unionization with A. Philip Randolph and the others is one that we should know about. All right, so throughout this entire time period, as these women were organizing, this woman was involved in a lot of these struggles, but her name isn't known to a lot of people, but her influence is felt. Because if you know anything about Malcolm X, and if you know anything about the Black Power movement, you are seeing the seeds of her influence. Malcolm X would not have been as African conscious and internationalist as he was without this woman and her sister Eloise, and some other women that were activists in Harlem. Queen Mother Audley Moore also was influential in many of the pioneers of the Black Power movement, including the Revolutionary Action Movement and other organizations. She spoke at the Million Man March at the age of 98, I think. She was there and she spoke. So this woman's time period spans all the way from Garvey to the Million Man March in 1995. And she was active throughout that entire time in so many of the struggles for African people. And she's a humble origin, born in New Orleans. And I want you to hear from her first. But let me go to this timeline, so you just kind of get a sense of what we're talking about. So she was born not long after the Battle of Ottawa, and she lived all the way past this time frame. But she was most active between the 20s and the mid 1960s. So this is how much she influenced from the Garvey's time all the way up to the Black Power movement. She lived through and was active through all of this. So let's just hear from her briefly before we start talking about her and all the movements that she was involved in. So Daniel, if you wouldn't mind playing the video of the interview with Queen Mother Moore. Now this interview is from 1985, where she's talking.
My name is Earl Pinto, and I'm the guest host of the Flo Kennedy Show. We are greatly honored to have as our guest today a great woman, a freedom fighter for African people throughout the world. Her name is Queen Mother Moore. Welcome, Queen Mother. How did you become known as Queen Mother Moore?
Well, that name was bestowed upon me by the African students, first of all. as a result of my years of activities in this country, they gave it to me. When I went to Africa, to Dr. Nkrumah's funeral, the chief heard about me, and he sent for me to come to him. And I went, and he said, I'm going to make you officially Queen Mother, the Queen Mother of the Ashanti. And he initiated me to Queen Mother. But I was Queen Mother before I went to Africa.
Did you personally know the late Kwame Nkrumah?
Yes, I did. And you were here.
Okay, you met him while he was
Yes.
visiting here?
Yes,
Okay, and that is in conjunction with your work.
yes,
I understand that you sent a petition to the United Nations in, I think, 1957 for reparations for the Black people in America. Explain something about that to us.
yes. The petition called for us to go back to Africa, for those who wanted to go back. And for those who wanted to stay here, there had to be certain indemnity given for the people who wanted to stay, the people who wanted to go.
What kind of indemnity?
Well, I was asking for $200 billion
$200 billion
dollars,
to indemnify.
yes, for the injury that we have received. The injury as a result of our enslavement.
Okay, that's for our 400 years of enslavement.
Yes,
As reparations, we
yes,
requested $200 billion.
yes.
Okay, when you sent this petition to the United Nations, what kind of response did you get?
I got very good response. It told me that we needed a member nation to introduce the resolution since we were not officially members of the UN.
Is this with your work with the Republic of New Africa?
No, that was not. I read as a member of the Ethiopian Women, the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women.
I understand that you founded that organization.
Yes,
And what was that organization about?
to save our men from execution. They were being executed at the rate of 2 a week almost. There was somebody being executed.
That unjustly executed?
Yes, we thought they were unjustly executed. And we tried to save some of them. We did save some
Mention it
from
here.
execution. Labat and Corey. We saved those. We saved Jenkins. We saved another brother.
Well, there was a number of people that were saved from execution because they were unjustly charged with crimes.
Yes,
And where did this take place?
in New Orleans.
Okay, you're from New Orleans, I
Yes.
understand. Okay. And then you also worked with Marcus Garvey.
Yes.
Tell us first something about Marcus Garvey.
Well, I was first brought into Marcus Garvey movement by the fact that I understood that he was to come and speak to us in Louisiana. And we went to the meeting, and lo and behold, he didn't come. And we heard that the mayor refused to allow him to come. So we were very incensed about it and got a delegation to go see why. And then it was guaranteed that Marcus Garvey would come the next night. And the hall was packed with people. And everybody went with ammunition.
They had guns?
They had guns. Everybody had guns. Blue Steel, Smith & Wessons, German Lugers. We had plenty of German Lugers because, the war had boys from the war and everything. And I had 2 guns with me. And they all had guns and ammunition, a bag of ammunition. Everybody had what you call a suitcase today. We used to call satchels
What was all this?
of ammunition.
Why were you so armed?
Because we was afraid the police would stop him from coming again. And we wanted to protect him. And so we went, 3,500 people. was in that hall. And so when Garvey came, we applauded very much. And he said, "My friends, I want to apologize for not speaking to you last night, but the reason I didn't speak to you is because the mayor permitted himself to be used as a stooge by the police department to prevent me from speaking to you." And when he said that, the police jumped up and said, "I'll run you in." And when the police did that, everybody jumped up on the benches. We had benches then. And took out their guns straight up. The guns were straight up in the air. "Speak, Garvey, speak." And Garvey said, "And as I was saying," and he went and repeated himself. And the police filed out of there like little puppy dogs with their little tails between their legs. Every policeman filed out of the hall.
Okay, after which I understand you started a chapter of his organization?
No, I didn't start a chapter. We had a chapter going down there.
Okay. And you purchased stock in
the Black Star Line, yes.
What was that? What was the Black Star Line?
Black Star Line was ships that Marcus Garvey was buying.
For what purpose?
To go to Africa. To trade with Africa. He was going to trade with the West Indies and Africa.
And what was the result of the purchase of the ships? Did they ever get to Africa?
No, the people sabotaged the ships. There was great sabotage. You know, on Garvey's board, he had a lot of enemies of our people. You couldn't talk about Africa in those days without expecting the agents to be around you. You had the agents of Belgium, you had the agents of France, you had the agents of England, and all those agents were sitting on his board.
Or trying to sabotage his work?
And yes, in the form of black skin.
Okay.
You see, so they sabotaged the ships.
All right.
And then they charged Garvey with fraud because they were saying that he was selling unworthy ships, you know.
How did the work of Marcus Garvey influence your life?
Oh, very much so. Oh, yes, because he taught me about the glories of Africa. I never went to sleep anymore since then. Never. I did much study since then of my own.
On the glories of Africa?
Yes.
You've made numerous trips to Africa. I
Yes.
understand that you recently attended the Women's Conference, International Women's Conference.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Yes, that was very great. It was very widely attended with 8,000 women.
Okay.
Yeah.
During your travels, recent travels to Africa, you went to Ethiopia, I understand.
Yes, I went to Ethiopia.
Did you witness some of the family?
No, they didn't let us go there. We didn't see anything of the famine. You wouldn't even know they had a famine. They kept that from the people.
I guess that's sometimes like people living in New York never get to see Harlem.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
They just show you
That's right. The part they want you to see. That's right.
You have land in upstate, Parksville, I believe it is.
Yes.
It's you have the Mount Addis Ababa.
Mount Addis Ababa.
Okay. And you doing work on that mountain.
Well, we want to build a college of African studies. We want to build a monument to the 100 million Africans who perished in the slave trade. And for those who died since, all the people who died in the struggle. 100 million died in the slave trade, yes.
So that's our whole Holocaust.
Yes, that's our Holocaust. Yes.
All right, this institution that you want to build, the purpose of it will be to educate Black people?
Yes, to educate our people, to help our people to understand, to de-Negroize us. To de-Negroize us, change our minds from European minds. We had no idea the condition that we're in, the psychoneurosis that we suffer. We suffer a terrible, terrible life. We don't know who we are. We use European names, and we just are comfortable with our condition. We really don't know who we are. We have no idea. We're captive. And we absolutely comfortable with this situation.
I know I feel personally very
Positive, Daniel, thank you. I just love ending that with that part. But that's Queen Mother Moore. That's who she was about. So we're going to break down a little bit of some of the things that she talked about that she was involved in her life. And the first thing, of course, being the Garvey movement. Now, when she talked about the Garvey movement, she spent most of the time talking about Marcus Garvey himself and when he came to New Orleans and the work that he did, opening up Black people's mind to the glories of Africa, its past and Africa's future. But Garvey didn't build that organization by itself. And that organization would go on to be the largest organization Black people have ever created, 6 million members present in dozens of countries. And the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Community League was firmly the product of not only Marcus Garvey, but of Amy Ashwood Garvey and Amy Jacques Garvey, the two wives of Marcus Garvey, not at the same time. They weren't married. He wasn't married to these two Amy's at the same time. So I'll talk about Amy Ashwood first. She had married Garvey. They had met in Jamaica when he came back from traveling abroad, and he had come back with the idea to establish the UNI, and he told Amy Ashwood about it, and she heard him speak, and he heard her speak at these speaking engagements that they would have in Jamaica. And when Garvey saw Amy Ashwood, he said, in her, I found my Josephine, relating to Napoleon and Josephine. So they formed the UNIA with a couple of other people together. So Amy Ashwood Garvey is a co-founder of the UNIA. And a lot of people don't say that. When they say the UNIA, they say founded by Marcus Garvey. It was co-founded by Amy Ashwood Garvey. And she helped grow the organization. When Garvey went to the United States in 1916, she came up to the United States not long after. They were actually married in, I think, the year 1920. If you want to read more about these women, this book, The Veiled Garvey, The Life and Times of Amy Jacques Garvey, is a good text, as well as Keisha N. Blaine's book, Set the World on Fire, Black Nationalist Women in the Struggle for free and the Global Struggle for Freedom, which talks not only about the two Amy's, but also the other women that played key roles in the UNI. Excuse me. So Amy Ashwood Garvey, she comes up to Harlem with Marcus Garvey in the 19 teens. And this is when the organization explodes. So it's growing in Jamaica. He goes to Harlem, and then it really blows up because he has this message that appeals to people like Queen Mother Moore, even though she ran into the Garvey movement in New Orleans. But it was the everyday masses of Black people that Garvey appealed to, with a message of be proud of your African heritage. And more importantly, be ready for Africa's future, because Africa is going to be for the Africans, Europe for the Europeans, and Asia for the Asians. This was the time of colonialism. He said, we want the Europeans out of Africa. And we want the children of Africa around the world to recognize that unless Africa's free, you're never going to be free in the Americas until Africa is free and strong and is powerful. He taught a message of self-reliance that was very similar to Booker T. Washington's, that Black people, the government's not going to do for you. You have to do for yourself. It's very much like the Black Women's Club movement, where self-reliance, educate yourself, be proud of who you are. And Garvey was such a charismatic speaker that this really appealed to Black people that were coming from the South up north, Black people who had lived in the ghettos in the North, in Philadelphia and Boston and New York, Black immigrants from the Caribbean that are coming up, just like Garvey, to New York, to Philadelphia, to Boston, and other places. And of course, Blacks in the continent that are hearing this Jamaican talk about ending colonization, And there were actually rumors going around all over Africa that Garvey was going to bring a army of blacks from the West to liberate Africa. That was a rumor going around South Africa and Namibia. And just like Queen Mother said, the Europeans were incredibly afraid of this. So Garvey was a key organizer in all of this. Excuse me. Garvey was a key organizer. I mean, a key speaker, but a lot of the organization of this, and Garvey was a great organizer, but so was Amy Ashwood. As chapters grew around the country and ultimately around the world, Amy Ashwood is one of the main people handling correspondence, helping with the organization. There was even an attempt on Garvey's life where this deranged man came up into the building to shoot Garvey, and Amy Ashwood jumped in between the gunman and Garvey and fought the gunman. They rolled down the steps. She was protecting Garvey. Ultimately, though, their marriage didn't last. They ended up getting divorced, and it's not long after that they got divorced that he marries Amy Jacques Garvey. But it didn't stop Amy Ashwood's activism, because she was active before she met Marcus Garvey, and she was active after she got divorced from Marcus Garvey. In fact, her time after Garvey's divorce, she travels the world. She moved to London in 1930 and opened up a restaurant and a social parlor. Now, this just wasn't a place where you could go get food and have a good time. It was a place for the African students in London and African activists in London to meet, to discuss, to plan, and to organize. She, in the 1930s, when the Italians invaded Ethiopia, she organized the International African Friends of Ethiopia. These were activists all over the globe that were incensed that Europeans were going to try to colonize the place that they could never colonize, which was Ethiopia. We talked about the importance of the Battle of Ottawa over the past couple of weeks. So when the Italians came back, Africans all over the world were like, no, we can't let this happen. She assisted in the founding of the Nigerian Progress Union, which ultimately became the West African Student Union, one of the most important student groups to exist in the African world. So many leaders came out of this group that would ultimately lead their countries to independence. So many of the early leaders of Nigeria came out of this group. She participated in the Council on African Affairs and the International African Service Bureau in the 1940s. Activist movements that brought together Africans that were studying in the US, that were studying in Europe, activists back home on the continent, all with the idea of how do we liberate Africa from colonization. She was an international organizer, traveling all over the world, speaking, bringing people together, bringing students together, activists together, one of the key players in the anti-colonial movement. You see her here with Paul Robeson. This is for the International Friends of Ethiopia. They're organizing and, trying to put pressure on Britain and the United States to live up to what the League of Nations mandate was, that to not allow countries to be aggressive with one another. And Ethiopia was a member of the League of Nations. So what they were going around doing to the diplomats in London, in the US, was saying, hey, this is the laws that you created. Uphold the laws. Don't allow Italy to invade Ethiopia. So she's with activist and actor and singer and athlete Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson, and I've said this before in class when I brought him up, we need to do a class just on Paul Robeson. He was that important and that significant of an individual. The level of athlete of a LeBron James, the level of a singer of Luther Vandross, an actor like Denzel, and an activist who threw all of that away to support Black people. He's really important. Next to him is Claudia Jones from Trinidad, who's a high-ranking official in the U.S. Communist Party. Again, another African woman who wrote about the triple oppression faced by African women because of their race, because of their gender, and because of their class status as workers. She's a great journalist. She had grown up in Harlem. She had seen her mother die at an early age. She actually contracted a respiratory disease because of the work that she was doing in factories in Harlem. And she spent her life advocating for Black people as workers. And then there's Paul Robeson's wife next there. But Amy Ashwood Garvey brought these people together. That's her with the West African students in London. Key organizer. Again, she was active in organizing the resistance, the international resistance to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. This was an event that, again, Africans all over the world were incensed and actually wanted to go fight in Ethiopia. when we talked in this class or other classes about Johnny C. Robinson, the black African-American pilot that founded Ethiopia's Air Force that fought in Ethiopia. And then there were thousands of other black men that wanted to fight in Ethiopia, but they couldn't. Well, all this was going on at the same time. The Ethiopians aren't just waiting for international help. They're fighting. They're fighting against the Italian aggression. And these are the patriots. These are the people that, as the Italians were coming in, they met them at the battlefield and they fought heroically against the Italians who had better weapons and who had no respect for the rules of international warfare. They used poison gas in Ethiopia. All the things that were actually illegal that the world government said you can't do this in war, they did that in Ethiopia. But the Ethiopians fought. One perfect example of Ethiopian patriotism was Sheroes Gedle. She's not still alive. I don't know when she died. This is why I have the question mark. I'm still looking for that information. But what we know of her is mostly about her exploits in this war. She came from a relatively privileged family, and she sold a lot of her family's possessions, including land, to arm the patriots that were fighting against the Italians. She had an espionage circle where she would infiltrate and have people infiltrate the places that the Italians were able the territories that the Italians were able to control, to get information about the Italians' movements. She was captured and tortured several times by the Italians, but never gave up information and survived until the end of the war, fighting against the Italians, leading assaults on when the Italians had taken over certain neighborhoods in Addis Ababa, the capital. She led assaults on the Italian strongholds. Very influential revolutionary figure and patriot and activist and defender of our country. And I just love the images. I'm gonna blow this up and put this up in my house because it just looks so cool with the afro and the gun and everything like that. So this is the type of women that the Italians had to deal with when they invaded Ethiopia. And these women were supported by African women all over the globe who were with them in solidarity. So, Ethiopia ultimately gets free, and the Fifth Pan-African Congress is held in 1945 at the end of World War II. And this is one of the most important events in African world history. And the first person to chair a panel at this, to kick everything off, was Amy Ashwood Garvey. Amy Ashwood Garvey was there. And she, as one of the organizers of the event, one of the speakers at the event, she shared the stage with W.E.B. Du Bois, who was Garvey's rival. But as Garvey passed away in 1940, Du Bois realized later on that, Garvey has some correct things and there's too much ego involved. But this is kind of like the symbolic bringing together of their ideas. So Du Bois is there. Kwame Nkrumah is there. Jomo Kenyatta is there. Other future leaders of independent African states are there at this meeting where they decide in 1945 that enough is enough. Europe is weak after their second tribal war. Now it's time for independence now. No more asking nicely for African self-government and we want independence now. So the leaders left this conference going back to Africa. And by the time we get to 1965, about 20 years later, most of those countries are free from colonialism.
Where was that?
Manchester, England. Yeah, Manchester, England. Funny little story though about this conference. While it was going on and things were being organized, a letter was sent out by Amy Jacques Garvey saying that, there's this woman going around saying that she's the widow of Marcus Garvey and all this, but I'm the only true widow of Marcus Garvey, and this woman is she's talking about Amy Ashwood Garvey. So they had some contention. Amy Jacques Garvey said that she never knew Amy Ashwood Garvey. Amy Ashwood Garvey said, no, actually, we grew up together in Jamaica, and you were actually the maid of honor at my wedding, but somehow you ended up marrying my husband. So that it's interesting. But aside from all that gossip stuff, just like Amy Ashwood, Amy Jacques Garvey was an activist in her own right as well. And when she joined Garvey organization as a secretary, she's working, and then she marries Garvey. And not long after that, Garvey actually gets arrested for what Queen Mother Moore was talking about in that interview. The United States accused Garvey of mail fraud. This was all set up by the FBI under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover. This is where J. Edgar Hoover emerges. in the 1920s destroying the Garvey organization. And he's going to keep on trying to destroy black organizations all the way up to the Black Power movement. So he's there throughout this whole thing as well. And Hoover actually hires the first black agent in the FBI specifically to help destroy the Garvey movement, a man by the name of James Wormley. And we talked about him in our whole class we did on snitches and sellouts. But anyway, Garvey gets arrested not long after his marriage to Amy Jacques Garvey. And she basically takes over the organization. She becomes the de facto leader of the organization. She is responsible for making sure that the Negro World, this Garvey newspaper that goes all around the African world, is published. She edits the women's section of the Negro World. And she writes a column called Our Women and What They Think, which comes out periodically, where she talks about the plight of African women and the importance of African women in leadership positions and what that means. So again, just like Amy Ashwood, Amy Jacques is an activist and a leader in her own right. She's not just Mrs. Marcus Garvey. She runs the organization while he's locked up in a penitentiary in Atlanta. Eventually, when Garvey's deported, they go back to Jamaica. She edits the People's National Party's newspaper in Jamaica in the 1940s. She has 2 children by Marcus Garvey. So she's a mother. She continues to be an activist. She publishes books on Garvey, a book called Garvey and Garveyism. And more importantly, she compiles together the philosophies and opinions of Marcus Garvey, probably the text that most people are familiar with. If they read anything by Garvey, they usually read the philosophies and opinions of Marcus Garvey, which is a 2-volume set. And in fact, Kwame Nkrumah, who was at that 5th Pan-African Congress, who becomes the president of independent Ghana, who is the foremost Pan-Africanist in the 1960s, he writes, of all the literature that I studied, the book that did more than any other to fire my enthusiasm was the philosophies and opinions of Marcus Garvey, published by his wife. Because Nkrumah was a student in the United States in the 1930s in Harlem. This is where he met Queen Mother Moore, who when the interview asked her, so you knew Kwame Nkrumah? Yeah, she knew Nkrumah because Nkrumah was a poor student in Harlem in the 1930s where Queen Mother Moore was active. And she was in the Garvey organization and founded organizations after the Garvey organization was lessened because of Garvey's incarceration and deportation. So she knew Nkrumah, she knew Nnamdi Azikiwe, she knew the African students. And they all were reading and studying and learning from Marcus Garvey. Another very influential woman in the Garvey organization was a woman by the name of Louise Langdon Norton. Louise Langdon Norton, she was from Grenada. She had migrated to Montreal, and she had joined the Garvey movement in Montreal. She was a writer for the Negro World. She was a columnist. And in Montreal, she met a man by the name of Earl Little, who was a Baptist preacher. So Earl Little and Louise Langdon Norton, they meet in the Garvey organization. They would have a number of children together, and Louise Langdon would teach those children. While Earl Little was preaching Garvey's message all over the United States, Omaha, Nebraska, and Michigan, Lansing, Michigan, they would have their house burned down because he refused to stop preaching Garvey's movement. It was believed that he was killed because he was an advocate for Garvey's movement. And then Louise Langdon, who's now Louise Little, was forced to raise all of these children with her husband being assassinated or killed, depending on which story you hear, because he might have just died accidentally, or he might have been assassinated. It's still kind of debated. And the state attacks her because Earl Little was able to purchase a lot of land that the state wanted. So the state made it really hard for her. And she ended up suffering some mental health issues as a result of all of this going on. But before all of this, she had inculcated into her children a love of being African. She had taught them to read and write. She knew how to speak several languages. She taught her children languages. But ultimately, like so many mothers who aren't given the proper mental health and just general health coverage by the state, and then being Black, her children were separated from her, many of them, put into foster care. One of her children, named Malcolm Little, was put in the foster care system. He eventually drops out of school at the 8th grade, and it takes him a while to come back into the movement because he gets into the street life. But he always remembered being taken by his father to Garvey meetings, learning from his mother. That child, Malcolm Little, will become Malcolm X. So his mother was one of these women intimately involved in the Garvey movement, and his father as well as a Garvey minister. So all of this is going on in the 1930s and 40s, and Queen Mother Moore is actively involved. After the Garvey movement, she eventually joins the Communist Party of the U.S., which was not unheard of. A lot of the Africans that left the Garvey movement went into other organizations, and many joined the Communist Party because the Communist Party was the only interracial organization in the U.S. that was actively fighting for Black people's rights. They were active in the Scottsboro case, a case of these Black boys on this train that were accused of raping a white girl, and they were locked up, and they were ranging in age from, I think, 18 to 12 or something like that, and they were being thrown in jail almost, I think, for life. But the Communist Party, NAACP, they rallied against this mistrial of justice, and the Communist Party wrote in its literature that they supported the right to Black people to self-determination. So this drew many Black activists to the Communist Party because they were the only organization that says, yeah, this United States is structurally racist. Black people are being exploited as workers. Black people are being exploited because of their race. And we need white workers to understand that your future lies with the emancipation of Black workers. The Communist Party was saying this. So she joined. She would eventually leave the Communist Party, though. Because they would change their position on a lot of things in the 1950s after World War II. She joined in the 30s and 40s. It was much more radical. By the time we get to the 40s, 50s, they start changing some positions. Like, yeah, we think Black people should have self-determination, but we don't think Black people should have their own country. Because that was one of the things the communists were eventually saying. The Black people should get parts of the South and determine if they want to stay a part of the United States or not. There was also the whole flip-flopping on colonization. Prior to the 1940s, the Communist Party internationally said, yeah, colonization is wrong. These colonies in Africa and Asia should be free. But during World War II, once Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, the Soviets allied themselves with the British and the French and the Americans, and then that talk of independence now started to wane a little bit. So a lot of Blacks in the Communist Party were like, okay, we see what's really going on here. This is really about preserving the Soviet Union. You're not really living up to all those international principles that you're saying, because when it really gets into it, you will, just like all these other groups, you will put Black rights and independence to the side for your own benefit. So a lot of them left. She left for another reason as well. She got tired of seeing in the Communist Party so many brothers messing around with the white women in the Communist Party. That was her own personal. She was like, you're just taking all of our men. These white women are just joining the Communist Party. They're taking all the Black men, and she didn't like that. So that's one reason. That's the other reason why she left the Communist Party. She formed the Civil Rights Congress, the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, which I'll talk about in a minute, the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women. This is an organization of her and other former members of the Garvey movement, these Black women that wanted to form an organization of Black women to support the entire Black community, including people that were on death row and other things like she mentioned in the video. The Reparations Committee of Descendants of United States Slaves. Very important. She was one of the early pioneers of this idea of reparation, that Black people should be paid an indemnity for their treatment as enslaved people. And she took it even a step further. She said, we can see the crimes of slavery in us. She always pointed to her own phenotype, her own skin color. She said, I'm this light because my grandmother was raped by slave masters. If you want evidence, if the government wants evidence of our injury, you don't have to look no further than our skin, than how we actually look. She was very clear on this. And she talked a lot about the sexual violence meted out against African women during slavery and afterwards in the South and throughout the country. So she was very clear on that. And then she also made a very interesting remark as well. She said, in another audio interview that I've ever heard, it's a very long audio interview that was done for an archive. She said, we weren't given a choice at the end of slavery. When I talked about that whole Reconstruction period, she said, we weren't given a choice about whether we actually wanted to become American citizens or not. No one gave us a plebiscite that asked, do you actually want to be an American citizen? Citizenship was forced upon us. You're citizens now. She said, we should have been asked if we want to be citizens or not, and what would have been the result of that. Well, that means we could have our own country in the United States, or if those of us that wanted to go back to Africa would have been able to. But the issue was we weren't even asked. We weren't even asked. So she made a lot of important arguments. One thing I'll say is when she says the Reparations Committee of Descendants of United States Slaves, she's not aligning herself, or she wouldn't align herself with those folks now that are calling themselves the American descendants of slavery, because she had a Pan-African outlook. She never disassociated herself from Africa, and even adopting that title of Queen Mother, like she said, she knew African history. She studied it because of the Garvey movement. She knew the important role of Queen Mother. So that title was given to her by African students in the United States that were studying in Harlem. They were like, you're acting like a Queen Mother. We're going to give you this title. Then it was officially given to her in Ghana when she went for Nkrumah's funeral, like she said in the video. But this is the organization I really want to talk about, the Sojourners for Truth and Justice. And they picked that name for a reason. These are Black women from all over the country, all over the U.S. and some from Canada, that were a part of those Black women's club movements, that were part of the Garvey movement, that were people like Claudia Jones, who were part of the communist movement, and they were all fighting for one cause, to better the life choices of Black women. And they formed this group, this organization, the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, named after Sojourner Truth. And in their writings, they talk about, we are invoking Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and all the work that we do. They organized a march. This is young Queen Mother Moore, by the way, on the right, and that's Claudia Jones with W.E.B. Du Bois, two great African communist intellectuals in the 1950s, Du Bois and Claudia Jones. Claudia Jones also would eventually move to London, and she's the person that established the carnival in London. So whenever you go to Brixton and the carnival, it's because of Claudia Jones. 1951. The Sojourners for Truth and Justice organized a march on Washington. So this is 12 years before the big march on Washington that we know about, 1963. They're there because they're fighting for the rights of Rosa Lee Ingram. Rosa Lee Ingram was a sharecropper. Sharecropping was, again, one of these things that resulted at the end of Reconstruction, where Black people were forced to work on the land of their former slave masters or other whites. And usually at the end of every season, you still were in debt to the landowner, so you had to keep working. It was basically like a form of slavery. Well, Rosa Lee Ingram her land was adjacent to a white sharecropper. So there was some white people that were sharecropping too, because exploitation was exploitation, but they still had white privilege, white superiority. This white man attempted to rape Rosa Lee Ingram. And her sons fought this man and killed him. But she gets arrested and sentenced to be executed. Her and her sons are sentenced to be executed for the crime of killing this white man. In 1948, the Black Sojourners for Truth and Justice and the other Black organizations, the NAACP, they rally and eventually get that sentence taken down to life imprisonment, which is still unjust. And appeals keep happening. And in 1951, these sisters make an appeal to all the Black women around the country to come to D.C. to shut D.C. down in support of Rosa Lee Ingram. And thousands of them come. And among them are Mary Church Terrell, one of the older activists, member of the Black Women's Club movement, co-founder of the National Association of Colored Women. You have Claudia Jones. You have W.E.B. Du Bois' wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois. You have Esmeralda Robeson, Paul Robeson's wife. You have Lorraine Hansberry, the young activist at the time, who is going to go on to write A Raisin in the Sun, one of the greatest Broadway plays. She's there. She actually reads the demands of the Sojourners for Truth and Justice. Queen Mother Moore is there. All of these women activists emerge in D.C. and fight, and eventually, by the time we get to 1959, Rosa Lee Ingram is released from jail. But she spent 11 years in jail for what? Defending herself against her sons, defending themselves against a rapist. She spent 11 years in jail. But that was a victory for Black, because she was initially sentenced to be executed and then life in prison. So they got her out. And that was a victory. But this was just one of the many cases that this group worked on. fighting against an unjust criminal justice system. This is the work that Queen Mother Moore did. Other issues that they fought for: the right to life, poverty and economic rights, political prisoners, the war in Asia. They were against the Korean Wars. This is before Vietnam. This is the issues they were fighting against in the 50s. Black self-determination and, of course, international solidarity. They made a lot of statements against apartheid in South Africa and colonization as a whole. So very important organization.
Yeah. When they say right to life, that means...
So black people would be free from lynchings and those types of things that were still going on in the 1950s, all up into the 60s. While she's doing all this activism, Queen Mother Moore also connects with Malcolm X in the 1950s, this young preacher for the Nation of Islam. Now, the Nation of Islam at the time did not really have a strong position on Africa, really. You know, they call themselves Asiatic Black Man and all this stuff, but it's when Malcolm in Harlem connects with people like Queen Mother Moore, her sister, who's also an activist, Eloise Moore, and others, Vicky Garvin, and others, that they sit this young minister down and they say, look, we like what you're doing, we like what you're preaching, but here's a little bit about Africa. Here's what's going on in the Congo. Here's what's going on in South Africa. Here's what's going on in Nigeria. Here's the anti-colonial movements. Here's what's going on in Bandung. Learn this information too. And Malcolm soaked all that stuff in like a sponge with all these sisters that used to be in the Garvey movement and in the Communist Party. And he's learning from all of this, in addition to the stuff that he's doing in the nation. And eventually, but when he breaks from the nation in 1963, 1964, he's able to fully articulate what he was taught by Queen Mother Moore. And that's him holding Claudia Jones's newspaper when he visits London. So it's a lot, and there's a very good article about these sisters that helped the ideological development of Malcolm X. So we'll stop there today because we're going to get into the Black Power movement and the sisters that were active in that, and also in the independence movements in Africa next week, and that's where we'll end up. So we'll talk about Black Power, which is happening at the same time as the violent independence movements in Africa, where these sisters fought valiantly against colonization. So that's where we'll stop today. I hope that you learned about Queen Mother Moore. I hope you can add her to your list of Sheroes. And next week we'll finish off this seminar, and and then we'll talk about next steps. So let me open it up to any questions. Daniel, anything in the chat, or are there any hands?
I don't see anything in the chat or any hands raised.
Okay, any announcements, anything folks want to bring up?
Pradeep, go ahead.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Dr. Ledbetter.
Good afternoon.
Great seminar. Actually, I wanted to just get your opinion on the new reparations law that's being enacted in California. I don't know if you're aware of that, but they are calculating what kind of reparations to give to the descendants of the African slaves, and I think one of the tasks is trying to identify who is eligible. But obviously, the amount is being calculated, and I think they've come up with a formula. I'm not sure what, but I just wanted to get your opinion on that.
I'll be interested when it starts to be implemented. I don't really have too much of an opinion on it. I think it's a good step. I'm interested why California though, and how I'm really interested in how they're going to decide that. Like, is it because of the state's involvement in slavery? Because California wasn't really that big of a slave state. There was slavery in California, but it wasn't like Mississippi. But I'm interested in how they're going to do that as well. So I want to read up on it by the time we get to the next class, so I can be more informed about it. But I know that was being discussed. But even when I first heard it, like last year, I was thinking, I wonder how they're going to determine that, and why California. I don't know why.
California was not maybe directly involved in the slavery part so much, but they were definitely involved in the genocide of the Native Americans.
Oh yeah, definitely.
For body parts.
Definitely.
So I'm just wondering if that is something that will work out. I mean, the reparations probably, I'm not sure if there's a Native American component in there as well
Well,
get that.
that's interesting because that actually complicates things. So if we're talking about reparations for indigenous people from the government, that's one conversation. But there's also a side conversation of the African people that were enslaved by Native Americans, because you have that as well, and that's a whole another element of things, particularly in Oklahoma, where you had groups of nations of indigenous people, the Cherokees, Choctaws, and others that had enslaved African people in places like Tennessee and Mississippi and Alabama. And when they were put on the Trail of Tears, they took their enslaved people with them. And now there's a whole fight among those descendants of, are we eligible for tribal benefits? Are we on tribal rolls? You know, how does that look? That's a whole another complicated question. So, yeah, the people that have to figure these things out, they have to really guys and put together this puzzle, because it's not a straightforward thing. Definitely. Daniel, what? Okay.
Question in the chat right now. Someone said more and more of the CIA's involvement in undermining Black Power movements and even global South democracies has been brought to life over the year. What has been the response to these insights over the years? Have countries impacted by America's involvement addressed these issues at all? And have American citizens themselves inquired more deeply about these things?
Some. I mean, you know, you have activists that have really been the main pushers using the Freedom of Information Act to get a lot of this stuff out. But in terms of the other countries, they know, and people know, and it's a lot of the stuff is redacted now. But it's like it's known, but there's no movement on it. And sometimes it's easily forgotten after a generation or two. Or if it's not right in the news, people forget about it. Like the School of the Americas and everything that institution did to destabilize parts of particularly Latin America. You know, so many documentaries have been made about it, but it's not really something that's talked about among the American public. So when election season comes around, these different things, like Americans don't really care about what the CIA does in other parts of the world. They act like they do. They're confronted with it as, oh my God, that's horrible. But no, it's not an election topic. No one ever brings it up. And imperialism just goes on as usual. There are anti-imperialist, anti-war groups in the United States, but they have not captured broad public support, and that's a shame. So it just takes consistent classes and things like this to keep that in people's mind, about what the CIA did internationally and then what the FBI did domestically to Black organizations. So when we talk about domestic, like the assassination of Fred Hampton, the setting up of Marcus Garvey, the surveillance on King and Malcolm and COINTELPRO, that's FBI primarily. When we talk internationally, the coups and the assassinations, that's CIA. And sometimes they work together, but it's really important to make that distinction so we know which one is which. Domestic stuff is FBI, international stuff is CIA, and they both have done nefarious things. But, you know, they recruit on HBCU campuses. They're always there, you know, and people forget about this history. And that's why they're able to still present themselves as the good guys in so many things. But yeah, so just got to get broader public historical education on these issues, and not present it from like a conspiracy theory lens, because that's what turns a lot of people off. It's like, oh, it was conspiracy. No, this is history. It's redacted. You can read it, and it's not. It paints your country in a different light that a lot of people don't want to see. Daniel, something pop up in the chat.
Yes, Mr. Francis, go ahead.
Well, thank you again. I just want to make a note here of the fact that Queen Mother Audrey left the American Communist Party because the black men were fraternizing with white women.
Yes.
How much has this changed?
According to a lot of circles, not much. But she just looked at it as contradictory because at the time, like the white men in the it wasn't like it was one way. Like it wasn't like the white men in the Communist Party were clamoring for the black women. And, you know, this is something that's going to come up in the next generation of black activists as well. In SNCC, where it was really dangerous. And a lot of the black sisters in SNCC were saying, you know, a lot of these young white girls are joining SNCC and messing with brothers, and it's really becoming a dangerous situation in the South because it's enraging the racists that are already, you know, mad that we're here. So yeah, the sexual politics of these movements is always a very interesting conversation. I don't think it's one that we have enough. But yeah, Queen Mother Moore was I think it's because she had started in the Garvey movement. So her initial political education was at the Garvey movement, which was always race first. So seeing that for her more so than other activists may have been like, what is going on there? Why is this so rampant? And you know, what are these brothers doing with their Africanness? Yeah, it's interesting. The sexual politics of these movements.
J. Edgar Hoover also tried using white women as bait for
Yes.
Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yes. Yeah. He tried to do a whole lot of different things, but yeah. Did something else pop up in the chat, Daniel?
Yes, it's just people saying thank you for the observations and for the breakdown.
Okay. Robert, go ahead.
Man, as always, lots of thoughts just spurred by the class, and then some announcements. But the first one would be the certainly part of what kind of perpetuated the myth of the FBI and the CIA as good are like all the TV shows and movies.
Mm-hmm.
Like I grew up watching a show called FBI with Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. All was right, like the shows was good. Even the ones that where they are somewhat critical, it's kind of framed as, well, there's some bad rogue people, right? But like the whole Mission Impossible thing, I don't think it's explicitly CIA, but it's similar. Like he's kind of like a CIA guy.
Mm-hmm.
He's fighting a few bad CIA agents. It's not like the organization is fundamentally like what it does, man. Right. So so just comments from the class. So yeah, we said, you know, lynchings being justified by whites, saying that, you know, black men are assaulting white women. It's really about economics. So that, you know, I always like to link this to like local stuff. So I look at what happened to Peter Slowly, and the people around him, right? So you know for sure, right, that Slowly didn't do anything like that because they would have looked to label that, and that's what they now his deputy chief, who's not black, who's a brown guy, who did Jaswal, all of a sudden he did get hit with a sexual assault thing. All of a sudden, and yeah, you know, you look at the facts there, it's like, right? So. So I'll leave it at that. Certainly seems like executions, like kind of the lynchings were replaced by executions, right?
Yeah, I mean, but they were going on at the same time.
Okay.
But
the lynching stopped though, but the executions have kept on going.
Yes, they have kept on going. But the only difference is now it's not so much for economic reasons. It's just outright just brutality. I mean, when you look at the numbers of people, well, first, the U.S. executes more people, black, white, whatever, than any other country, like with the exception of like China and some other places. And, you know, when you look at the numbers, a lot of these people are suffering from various mental health conditions, or they have severe learning disabilities. I mean, stuff that, you know, no civilized nation in the world would execute people. Nobody executes people anymore, really. I mean, it's very barbaric. And then when you break down the numbers demographically, you see the overrepresentation of black people, mostly black men, that have been executed. This past week, I think, or past couple of weeks, I think at least 3 black men have been executed in the States. So yeah, it's but the criminalization is definitely economically based. So that part of the prison industrial complex is still there. And we see this direct relationship between deindustrialization in America and over incarceration. It's like if we mapped it, you can see that, and how it's affected black and brown people. Yeah, definitely.
No, I'm glad. I'm glad you jumped in there to say or to raise the economic thing, because that's what I was going to say. Like it's in the work that I do with the hub, I'm starting to see way more clearly this entire ecosystem of how criminalizing our black youth creates a lot of really great jobs for mostly white people.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about, and it's being done by this. This goes to what we talked about again, the FBI and the CIA, how they're portrayed as good. So part of this ecosystem is we've got the same thing going on here. So organizations like the Boys and Girls Club, right? We're all growing up thinking, oh, they're great and everything. So here's one thing that the Boys and Girls Club does. They have what are called diversion programs, right, where they divert young folks who they say, this is on their website, have become involved with the law. And I'm like, do they have any critical analysis of why those people are becoming involved with the law in the first place? I'm like, no, I didn't see that. So then I thought, let me ask this question of them. I wonder if it's the police who refer youth to the Boys and Girls Club diversion program, right? So I was like, geez, I wonder if they're tracking the race of who those the kids or the police refer. So I asked them that, and I asked, like, this is the assistant to the executive or the CEO of the Boys and Girls Club, and they're not tracking it. Right? And that's by design. That's because if you track it, then we can go, what the fuck's going on? Right? But they're not. This whole kind of criminalization, again, so it's all like it's an ecosystem, right? So the Ethiopian famine. So that was the
that was 85.
1988 or 85.
85 for that video. Yeah.
Just this is one of those ones that makes you go, because it's in there's an Ethiopian famine in the news right now.
Yeah.
Right. And I heard at least one report from the CDC that was, again, framed as so many are, as like just framing Africans as these helpless victims of this horrible things going on with zero analysis of like Canada, the imperial power role in creating the famine in the first place, right? So these Africans are so, isn't this sad, right? So, all right, that'll just come now round table. So stuff that happened. All right, so follow up from last week, or 2 weeks ago, we said we're going to go take over the Ottawa Police Services Board meeting. That's exactly what we did. Mission accomplished. We went in there and we did an act of nonviolent civil disobedience, right? They said, yes, Mr. Basically, what we did was we said, we have, just to give people the frame. So the Ottawa Police Services Board operates where you can go in and do a 5-minute public delegation, but you're not allowed to ask any questions, right? So we go in, I speak there almost every month. Critical, other people do. We're all critical of the police. They don't ask any questions, and then they keep on giving the police multi-million-dollar increase, right? So we went in there and said, I did my 5-minute delegation, and then I said, when the chair said, "Oh, Mr. Brown, your 5 minutes are up. It's time to stop." And I said, "No, we're not." Then we said, "Today we're asking the questions, and we're not leaving until you answer them." So, anyways, we did that. Shut down the meeting. That was successful. Other thing that I attended yesterday was a meeting of the Parliamentary Black Caucus. Their pre-budget consultation. So black folks going in and telling the federal budget what to, where to spend money. And man, I gotta say, I was inspired, man. There were some really good, smart people in there making presentations. There's a number of sisters from arts organizations. One has this massive like arts conflict they build out west and want money for that. Another brother came in there who does environmental stuff, asked for $2 billion. Like some really, really impressive presentations. And my ask was to have the government appoint I mentioned this before, a Black equity commissioner, just like the one they already appointed on anti-Semitism and xenophobia. Got lots of support. People come up to me, I'm going, yeah. So all good. We're going to connect. Related to that, so Richard Sharp and a bunch of folks, actually some of the are off to Geneva this weekend. You had to go to the UN because the UN the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. That's the thing that's going to keep on going after the UN decade ends. It's having their first meeting, right? So they're all heading over there to just to give a report on what's going on in Canada, and one of those things that goes about reparations. So one of the reports from the working group that came here in 2017 and did a report on like anti-Black racism in Canada was reparations. That's in their actual recommendations that the Canadian government should be doing, right? So they'll be pushing for that. Basically, over there saying, they didn't give that didn't happen, and we gotta make that happen. So, and then the last thing will be, actually, when I was at the Ottawa Police Services Board meeting, I was wearing my T-shirt that says the Black Legal Militia on it. And all the talk today with Edgar Hoover kind of makes me think, see the way he was using the legal system and the way they've used the legal system against us? Yeah. That's exactly what the Black Legal Militia is all about. Us using the legal system in all its forms, legal and quasi-legal, for us instead of the way it's been used against us by people like Hoover.
That's it. Yeah, that was I saw the video, and then it was the first story on the Ottawa Citizen. I think it was the first story on the website, because Ottawa's not used to. It's like what you said when you were there. It's like it's not going to be business as usual. Ottawa's used to functioning business as usual. So anything out of the norm, they get shook up, and you could see how shook they were.
Well, and here's the thing. So as I mentioned, I speak every month. So I've asked to speak at the December meeting, and I was kind of curious what they'd say. So they have accepted, and I'm like, man, I cannot wait to see the look in their eyes when I put the microphone in.
This is just, anything in the chat, Daniel?
Yes, there are a few questions. Somebody asked, what is the biggest threat for Black leaders now? Is it outside forces or is it not knowing our history?
The biggest threat for Black leaders?
Yes.
Well, it depends what we mean by Black leaders. If we're talking about authentic servant leaders, people that are actually going to try to push our people forward, I think there are no threats. And what I mean by that is, if you're authentic and you're serving the people, you just do it. And you don't measure your success by if you are able to enact something in your lifetime. That might not be the case, but your contribution will live on. So you don't think about it in that way. So you don't think about the threats. Dr. King talked about this. When Dr. King used to Dr. King suffered from some severe issues in terms of anxiety for a lot of it, particularly after years after he got stabbed. And he thought about death a lot, to the point where he would get like tremors and have anxiety attacks, and developed a stutter and a tic that a lot of people didn't know about. And it's only when he realized that I'm going to die anyway. We're all going to die. That's going to happen to everybody. So there's no sense of trying to, preserve yourself in that way. Nobody. He didn't have a death wish, but he said, "Look, this is going to happen. So I'm going to live my life and fight for my people as much as I can." So when you have that type of mentality, the threats, you're not overly worried about them to the point that you stop doing shit. So that's not a threat. You could have obstacles. Now, the biggest obstacles I would say are for authentic Black leaders. Oh yeah, you got the folks on the outside that don't want to see succeed. You got folks on the inside with lack of historical knowledge, lack of true commitment to the people. that will fight against you, but you always have that. So those obstacles will always be there. You just continue to fight and continue to work. Yeah, for inauthentic leaders, though, like the people that put themselves up as leaders, I think the biggest threat to them is us becoming aware of and easier, and we're better able to identify puppets. And I think we're getting better at that as a people. You know, we're not where we need to be, but we're getting better with that. I think we're getting better at recognizing authentic leadership, hopefully. I don't know if that completely answers it, but there's just some initial thoughts on that. What else is?
The last question I see in the chat, somebody said, I saw an interview with D.O. Hughley, and he mentions that most Black men in jail have dyslexia or another learning or mental health disability that makes them less compliant. Is this accurate? Is this accurate? More importantly, is this information even fairly widely known?
I don't know how I'm not saying it's not. I just don't know. I don't know that particular statistic. But knowing the education system, I wouldn't be surprised if it was something close. And it's not something that's wrong with these people. It's something that's wrong with the education system that, as we've called it many times before, it's a school to prison pipeline. So you have an education system that fails to properly educate these young people, fails to properly recognize the learning needs of Black children, which can lead you to penitentiary in a lot of cases. So I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know that particular statistic, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was true. And there's a lot of statistics about incarceration that we know, but that aren't widely discussed, and they should be. We're too often quick to focus on what the individual did to get incarcerated. In our community, we're very judgmental in that regard. And, you know, and I can speak for that because I don't know, many of you watching got people that are locked up right now. The statistics just make that the case. I know I got family members that are in and out of jail, and sometimes you're just like, man, can't this person just get it together? But when you zoom out and you look at everything going on, you realize, okay, well, they got locked up when they were 18. They get out with a record. So even if they did something small when they're 18, they still got that record. So now they can't get student loans to go to school if they wanted to. They might not be able to afford to get certain things that you need to get IDs updated and different things to go get another job. Then when they see that record, you can't get that. So then that leads you to what I'm supposed to do. I got kids, so now I'm going to do something to make money, which could get you locked up again. So we have to look at these things and study statistics, and as a community realize that it really is a trap. And we got to do a better job of working with our young people, like these sisters did with the Black Women's Club movement. We know the education system is not doing right by our children. And as we continue to fight against that system, and we have some great activists and great people that are in the system that are fighting for change, that are outside the system fighting that system for change. But at the same time, there are things that we can do ourselves with our young people. We've got to take the extra time, work with our young people, do these things so that we can identify those things early so that they don't get caught up in these systems that don't mean them any good. So, yeah, I would be interested to know if that was true or not. I'm not sure. Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, to comment on that, I'm not familiar exactly with that stat, but I would suspect that the first part is probably true in terms of the high level of like learning disability. That last part though about that making folks less compliant, I suspect no. But basically, what's actually going on as we see is, you know, Black folks are stopped and they're very compliant, but then they question, let's say, their basic rights. Why is this happening? All of a sudden they get slammed at the ground and they get charged with resisting arrest, right?
Yeah.
The again, bringing this back locally, the Ottawa police in the beginning of this year released some data on their use of force by race that they were forced to collect. One of the things that did not get very much attention from that report was that it showed that white folks who are like more combative with the police get less severe treatment than black folks who aren't. Let me just repeat that. White folks are more combative, they get better treatment than black folks who are compliant. So that's what's actually going on.
There we have it. Anything else, Daniel? Anything pop up?
Yes, I see one last question. It says, is there a practice or philosophy from any African spirituality to help us see beyond our own lifetimes of no community work, so we stay committed even if we won't see the immediate fruits of our effort?
Oh, I mean, I think a lot of them. I mean, because in many of those philosophical and spiritual traditions, your physical dies, but your essence remains and can be called upon by other people. So I can't point to one in particular, but almost any of them will lead you to the understanding that your physical life is just one experience and that you're going to continue to live on. And even if you really think about it, if you do well, your memory will live a lot longer than you, and people will remember you and will learn from your example, and your energy will continue to manifest itself in different struggles. Just like Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman has been dead since 1913. She's been dead a lot longer than when she was alive, but yet we still invoke her and her approach to struggle and the things that we do. So you find that in a number of religions and spiritualities. So any of them, just take a pin, throw it at the continent of Africa, and you'll find a culture of spirituality with that tradition. Yeah. All right, everyone. We'll close it there today. Last session next week. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll talk soon. Take care.